It is now, especially considering where it was in the 1990s, we will be discussing coming up here soon.
You are Locked On Wildcats, your daily podcast on the Arizona Wildcats, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thanks for keeping it Locked On Wildcats. I am your host, Mike Luke, with John Schuster. You got John. Who's number 21?
Is that Hassan Adams?
Or I thought that might have been Michael Wright.
Let's go with that.
Either way, how about Michael Adams?
I like that.
I was going to say, it sounds like a rocker from the 80s.
Hassan Wright works too.
Hassan Wright does. Doesn't sound like a rocker from the 80s, but although maybe it does. Sounds more like security backstage. But with John Schuster, I'm Mike Luke. We've talked a lot about where Arizona could possibly be going this coming year or these coming years. But I wanted to kind of go back in time a little bit this episode and talk about how did we get here in the first place. And my frame of reference is a little bit different than Shu's, at least growing up. Believe it or not, we're a few years apart in age. But when I was growing up in the 90s, Arizona, and I'm not saying that the Pac-12 was the Big East or it was maybe the ACC, but you had two programs in Arizona and UCLA that we joke about it all the time. Is it a top 5? Is it a top 7? These two programs mattered at the highest level. Arizona and UCLA, heck, they both won national championships, almost in back-to-back years. And then you had Stanford, which was a top 10 entity, and if not, it was right there. And you always had a couple other schools that, give or take, were always generally or were able to be impactful. ASU had a nice little run there. They made it Sweet 16, a couple tournament appearances. Oregon, Cal had a nice little run, even though they were cheating. But, who cares really right there? Now you look at it, and essentially, and we'll talk about football here in a second, but Pac-12 hoops is at least viewed nationally as kind of a joke. In the 90s, I don't remember that being the case.
And I don't think it really should be now either. And I think things are going to move in a direction that improves for the conference, assuming that the conference in some capacity is still around. I think Arizona's going to be a good basketball team with name recognition that's going to be favorably in the conversation for a while. And I think Oregon's pretty damn good. Mm-hmm. So those two things help a lot. And then from there, you hope that you can have some other teams try to fill in the gap. The team that is, unfortunately for the conference, the two teams that are leaving were doing very well. Right. And that gave the conference some depth that I think it hadn't had in some time. And that's going to be difficult. That's going to be tough to replace because, we talk about UCLA and their Final Four appearance and, a good seeding last year. They played a really hot Carolina team in one of the better games in the tournament, coming in the Sweet 16. So they've strung two legitimate seasons together that put them back into the conversation, and their recruiting classes are very good. The team that we constantly talk about, and this is kind of the entertaining thing, we spend a lot of air talking about how we never talk about USC. Mm-hmm. But USC's won on average 26 games a year, right? For the last 4 or 5 seasons now,
and they're always kind of in that top 3 to 4 realm in the conference, right?
Yeah, and them getting into the second weekend in the tournament is a very plausible scenario. Mm-hmm. The conference looked as though basketball-wise, it was improving its footing a little bit. And now this happens, and they're going to have to figure out ways, assuming that the incarnation of whatever this conference is doesn't change a whole heck of a lot. They're going to have to figure out ways to try to recruit a little bit better and find other teams that can get into the mix and try to fill the void as best as possible with a UCLA team on the upturn and a USC team that's a heck of a lot more competitive and consistent than generally they're given credit.
Do you think? Let's go backwards a little bit.
Sure.
Here. Why Arizona and UCLA? I mean, maybe I overstated the case right there because UCLA has been to 4 Final Fours in the past 15 years. I mean, Arizona hasn't been to a Final Four in over 20 years. So, I mean,
right.
But either way, Arizona is also kind of the king of, I think there's been 6 Elite Eight games in there that have been decided by about 9 points or something, and Arizona was on the losing end of almost all of them. But Stanford was always kind of that one that really, you know, when you have 3 programs of that ilk, Stanford, the way that Stanford has fallen off, is Stanford just kind of like it was with UNLV, Georgetown? Is Stanford just a one-coach school? Is that basically
I think so.
what it is?
And that's the danger for a lot of teams. And with programs like that, if you get the right guy in there, you can always win again and put yourself on better footing. This is I think going to be the legacy of Sean Miller, is that while you and I are not particularly thrilled with him necessarily as a person or his simplistic, relatively easy to scout approach toward the game, Miller was a good basketball coach that won at Arizona at a pretty darn good level and solidified the Wildcats as a program that went beyond a one-coach program. And that's a huge deal. That now means that a guy like Tommy Lloyd looks at this job and says, yeah, I can win there, as opposed to had Arizona hired somebody maybe and gone through the same growing issues that UNLV and Stanford and Georgetown went through. Does a guy like Tommy Lloyd leave Gonzaga to go to Arizona? Maybe not.
Right.
So Miller deserves a lot of credit for transitioning from a great coach who built a program and then making it more than a one coach program. And as a result, now Arizona is a brand that can be successful. And I think Tommy Lloyd is going to have very good success at Arizona. The difference, I think, and it's a bad comparison because Florida won national titles.
Right.
But the Florida UCLA comparison, I think, maybe has some general merit. Whereas Florida would either win national titles or win 15 games. And UCLA was kind of the same way. UCLA has had very deep tournament runs. You mentioned the Final Four appearances, or they win. They're a completely forgettable entity.
Right.
Whereas Arizona generally did a better job of being a 23-win basketball team, who would be anywhere, who was more often than not going to be in the tournament and very often going to be seated highly in the tournament. And when they were seated highly, certainly in the first half of Miller's reign here, they were usually going to get into the second weekend. So Arizona remained a factor in the conference. UCLA was inconsistent and occasionally good. And then you were trying to find some other teams that were still trying to gain footings. When Stanford dropped off, Oregon was the obvious team that should have taken that mantle. And Oregon's done a pretty good job of it. But maybe Oregon hasn't quite done enough yet. I think the potential is clearly there for Oregon to be a major player. They're obviously on the national stage and certainly a conference bolster when it comes to men's basketball. But now you have to find somebody else or a couple somebody else's to try to fill the void. And maybe that becomes a little bit more difficult and is clearly a challenge for a conference that's uncertain right now.
All right. One thing that you would want to do, though, is if you wanted to possibly bet on anything future related, you would go to the BetOnline Sportsbook. You would check it out there. You would say, all right, they've got the best odds. They've got the best futures. They've got the best everything I need. And I want to put down some money. I want to go to some place that's easy to navigate. You would check out the BetOnline Sportsbook app right there. We will be right back with you. Thanks for keeping it locked on, Wildcats. I'm your host, Mike Luke. Even more, maybe this is what I should have led with, but even more confounding is football. Let's just look in the 1990s. And I was talking with a good friend of ours, William Brad Alice, a little bit earlier about this. In the 1990s, here's the schools that had top 5 national finishes. Washington won a national championship, obviously, in 1991, had another top 5 finish later on in the 90s. Arizona had a top 5 finish and a top 10 finish in there. Oregon State had a top 5 finish. USC had a top 5 finish. Was it ASU had a top 5 finish? You had 6 teams that had top 5 finishes at some point during the 1990s. That doesn't occur. That hasn't occurred basically since the 90s. And not only has it not occurred, it hasn't even come close to occurring. Why is that?
There are a couple reasons, I think. I think even then the conference was difficult to get through, but an undefeated team or a one-loss team could make a lot of noise. And and that was at a time where, you had you did not have a 4-team playoff.
Right.
So a lot of those discussions with Washington and Oregon State and ASU and Arizona would have been, are they the 4th or the 5th team in some 14 playoff field? And if they did not get into that spot, then we're wondering again, well, why didn't the Pac-10, 12, whatever the hell number it is or will be, right. Get a team that was in the Final Four? And I think a lot of that has to do with it is a difficult conference to get through. For whatever reason, it's easier to get upset in this conference than a lot of the others. And I think to some degree, maybe the middle-level teams are a little bit more competitive sometimes. You've got some of the travel concerns that play into it a little bit. And, those things are a big deal in college football. You lose a game in college football, you're in bad shape.
Right. Unless you're in the SEC and you can maybe lose 2 or 3.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And to the SEC's credit, I guess, they're still winning national championships.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah, but they do get maybe the benefit of their reputation in the Pac-10, 12, 8, 16, whatever the hell number you want to throw in there. The Pac-X is going to be, is going to have a hard time ultimately.
That's funny on like 3 different levels right there.
Yes. They're going to have a hard time ultimately looking up. Was football better was football top to bottom better in this conference in the 90s?
Oh, I think it clearly was, wasn't it?
Or were there just better teams at the top?
Well, I mean, you look at it, and I think our Anthony Gimino, man, I'm throwing out names left and right here.
Man, you really are.
Always talks about it's the coach. It's the coach. I think that you could probably, or I would suggest that you could look
away.
I would suggest that you could look back and say that the coaches that were running those teams were probably amongst the best coaches in those programs' history. Mike Bellotti obviously was a fantastic coach at Oregon. Dennis Erickson, while he was only at Oregon State for a couple of years, but outside of Mike Riley, probably the most acclaimed coach in there. Who was that? Was it not Todd Graham? Was it Bruce Snyder that was the ASU coach?
Snyder was at ASU at their 1-year spike.
Right, and that was a little bit different than those ones because that was obviously a 1-year spike.
Oregon State was a 1-year spike as well.
Right, Dick Tomey was best coach in Arizona history. I think that's hard to argue. Don James was certainly the best coach in Washington history. So again, maybe I'm just grasping at straws here, but it seems
maybe it's me. I think it's a good argument, and I think it's not like Oregon's still a very good football team, but they're top 15 good. They're not top 5 good,
right?
And in college football, take it for what it's worth, because of the weird playoff system, you need to be top 5 good.
Right.
And that's where, because it's not like Oregon's a bad football team. Oregon wins 9 or 10 games a year. Utah's a good top 20 football team, but again, you've got to be top 5 good to get into that conversation. The problem is with the anchor teams like USC, the anchor team that is leaving. They went out to get Lincoln Riley because they didn't want to be a top 15,
right,
top 30 program anymore. So they went after Riley, who they thought could put them into top 5 territory. They could reclaim Pete Carroll's success, and now they're going to do that in another conference, which obviously is the most damning blow to the Pac-X at any stage in this process, and clearly it's going to be a difficult thing for the conference to replace. That isn't going to be easy because now Oregon you have to figure out a way to make Oregon top 5. You have to figure out a way to make Washington top 15 or top 20. Utah is going to every once in a while be in a conversation, maybe in November, but can Utah ever really run the table? I mean, probably not.
Right.
They're
and
really
they've got
good.
the feeling, and they've got the feeling too, as much as we like Utah, they've got the feeling too that it's kind of like a Cincinnati situation where if you did run the table, you'd probably get blasted by whoever you would play in that championship.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. They're a very and in fairness, Cincinnati got walloped, but so did Michigan.
Right,
so a
exactly.
team from a big conference got hammered by an SEC school.
Wait a second, an overrated Big Ten team got hammered?
Well, that's the reason USC is going to that league. Why not be overrated in that conference?
By the way, I do predict once Riley, it might take a year or two. I think outside of Ohio State, they're going to smash everybody in the Big Ten.
I mean, they bring a different kind. Well, them and Ohio State both bring speed to a league that doesn't really have it.
Right.
And that's a different animal to deal with. And I think you're right. I think a lot of teams in that conference, and there are good teams in the Big Ten, but and here's maybe an interesting level of conversation. You look at the overrated Big Ten. Ohio State's great. USC has a chance to be great, but is Michigan better than Oregon?
No.
Is Wisconsin negligibly better than Washington or Utah?
No.
But if you look at them from a ranking standpoint, Wisconsin could be ranked 7th,
Right.
and Utah could be ranked 13th.
Right.
Even though, and that probably has a lot to do, and that's the reputation issue I think that the conference is facing and now has to deal with even more.
Right. Okay. One thing though that we have a new sponsor here, LinkedIn. That's when you know when you got LinkedIn and Built Bar basically saying we want to be part of this, we want to get in on this. That's when you know that you're big time. So here's the deal. Again, I'm still reading this, as you can probably tell. So as the sun comes out and small businesses are back in business, LinkedIn Jobs makes it easier to grow your team. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the people you want to interview faster. So LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the candidates you could want to talk to faster. Did you know every week nearly 40 million job seekers visit LinkedIn? That's actually a lot, or LinkedIn. Post your job form on linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. Check it out. We'll be right back with you. With John Schuster, I'm Mike Luke. All right, Shu. So let me ask you this before we sign off here. It was Hansen that was the Pac-12 athletic commissioner before Larry Scott, correct?
I believe that's correct, yes.
What did you think of Hansen?
I don't know that I had much of an opinion.
Which probably, and I've asked a few.
Okay.
I've asked a few people that, and they've all given people like yourself who are smarter than me. They've all given both. They've actually there's 3 people involved here, so
Whoa.
both plus 1. But all 3 have said, "Yeah, I don't really remember much about him." I think that's a good thing, is it not? Because
Maybe.
you remember Larry Scott.
But and that's an interesting conversation. Let's bring that down. That's true. You do remember Larry Scott, but let's use it from Arizona athletic directors. You remember Ced Dempsey because he was excellent. You don't remember Livengood, which wasn't a bad thing,
Right.
but you do remember you remember Greg Byrne for the good and the bad,
Right.
So is where Tom Hansen fits into that conversation, I don't necessarily know, but he wasn't Ced Dempsey.
Right.
So was he the Livengood of Pac-12 commissioners? Maybe. And is that good enough to get your conference to where you want it to be on a national level? It doesn't necessarily hurt you. It creates stability, but does it build the brand in a way that you ultimately need? The Larry Scott had a chance to be Greg Byrne and build the brand. Instead, Larry Scott became all the bad things that Greg Byrne was. And that clearly doesn't bode well for the conference as a whole and the job that the conference has ahead of it.
I almost said Derek Scott. Larry Scott also just kind of looked out of place. He didn't look natural as a Pac-12 commissioner. He looked like, and again, people know the background, but he looked like a guy that would probably be more interested in watching women's tennis. I'm not putting him down like that. I don't mean that in a negative light. I'm just saying that he didn't look like the type of guy that was looking at his schedule saying, man, I can't wait for that USC Stanford game at 9 or, that we'll bury on Pac-12 network or something like that.
Yeah. Well, the issue is the Pac-12 network more than it is judging a book by its cover.
Right.
Larry Scott was innovative. Now, sometimes innovation is a disaster. And his hard line approach toward the Pac-12 networks, I think, is ultimately what put the conference in a bad spot, and then negotiating deals that didn't benefit them with larger television entities probably made the conference look like the conversation that we're having now. Second fiddle to the Big Ten, second fiddle to the Big 12, second fiddle to the ACC, second fiddle to, the SEC. And if you're a quote unquote Power 5 conference, really, you don't want to be viewed as a Power 4+1. Right. And that's why, and that's a lot of the reason why USC and UCLA have decided, all right, we're going to give the big 100 years. So what? I guess a century's enough. We'll give the Big Ten a shot.
All right. John Schuster, can't thank you enough. You all have a great weekend, and we will be back with you Monday, breaking everything down. Who knows? Maybe Arizona's gone on to declare for the NBA draft, and we got multiple guys in the NFL. Who knows? But again, you all have a great weekend. Thank you a ton for listening to the Locked On Wildcats podcast.